Now, if I'm not clear, you must ask. That's the key of the shield. If I'm not clear, you have to ask. Okay. And remember, we're doing it textually. Okay. What I want you to take from chapter 1 is that you have two souls. One is an animal soul. That animal soul has tendencies, depression and melancholy and sloth. And it has lust and has anger and has all negative things. We discussed it at length. We're going to come back to discuss the animal soul. Okay, the other soul we have is the godly soul, and that's what we're discussing today. I'm going to read a lot today, unlike the other shurim. I'm going to read a lot, then we're going to discuss chapter 3, and then I'm going to come back and do chapter 2. So we're going to whitewash it. We have to do one coat and then a second coat. Okay, the first thing we said last week, so if you could open the book to page, 50, and where we're up to in the book, discussing the godly soul, we said the godly soul is the second soul that a Jew possesses. So in other words, the first soul is the animal soul, and the second soul is the godly soul. Why is it called the second soul? And the reason it's called the second soul is, number one, the godly soul only starts to download properly after bat mitzvah or after bar mitzvah. And that's why girls are only obliged to do mitzvahs at the time of bat mitzvah and boys at bar mitzvah. So the godly soul is there, but it only really downloads. There's a similar concept brought in Jewish law. You don't greet a person before they've davened in the morning. I don't know if we overly practice it, but there is such a law. Why is that? Because it takes time for the godly soul to download, and prayer accomplishes that. So that's what, when a person goes to sleep at night, a little bit of the soul leaves the body. You draw it down. It comes back into your body when you wake up, and then through prayer and good deeds, it manifests itself, permeates itself through the body again. Okay. Now, so the reason why it's called the second soul is because it's revealed later in the body. 12 by a girl, 13 by a boy. Another reason why it's called the second soul, because the truth of the matter is, although the godly soul is holier than the animal soul, when the godly soul descends to this world and goes through all the trials and tribulations of working with its animal soul and fighting with it each day, every single time you hold yourself back from getting cross, every single time you subdue a negative emotion or negative thought, you're actually you're transforming the negativity, the darkness of your animal soul into light. You're transforming it into light. And that becomes more energetic than the godly soul. So why is it called the second soul, the godly soul? Because it gets something from the animal soul. So what you think are your biggest issues in life are your biggest blessings in life. What you think are your biggest challenges or your biggest opportunities. Because every single time you push away a negative thought, you're transforming the negativity of the animal soul into godliness, and that's going to give you turbo energy to shoot to a much higher level than you were before. And that's why the godly soul is called the second soul. We discussed the godly soul. We said as follows, that there are so many different analogies to explain the godly soul. Number one, we said it comes from God's breath. As opposed to every other creation, comes from God's speech. Okay? One sec. Okay, I'm studying chapter 2 and I'm on page 50. So you've got to just go down there, chapter 2, page 50. I just WhatsApped it to, okay, then. So I'm on page 50 in Lessons in Tanya. Now we said like this, that the godly soul that you possess, one of the ways, now we're trying to understand something that's spiritual, we think physical. So one of the ways of explaining it is it comes from God's breath. God blew the godly soul into us. It doesn't mean that God stood on a mountain and blew. What do we learn from breath? Breath is inner energy, as opposed to speech, which is external energy. Breath is internal energy. So when God blew a soul, we have a part of the innerness of God within us. The inwardness of God is within us. That's amazing. Just think about that. So if ever you get depressed in life, if ever you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, access the godly power of your godly soul. You have an amazing amount of godly energy. The problem is we don't tap into it. And sometimes God gives us challenges and trials and tribulations to bring out the energy of the godly soul. Okay. Now, I'm at the middle of page 50 in the Lessons in Tanya. Now, another way of discussing our godly soul, not only is it inner energy, but we're going to use another analogy now, and that we went up into God's brain. What does it mean we went up into God's brain? Just like a human being has different levels, there are different levels to God. What's the highest level of the human being? Our brain. What's the highest level of God? His brain. Whatever that means, we have to come back to that. How do we know we came from God's brain? B'nai Bechor Yisrael. The Torah says, Yisrael, you are my firstborn. Bonim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. You're children to God. So the Torah uses this poetry to speak about the Jewish people. that other nations are called creations, and we are called children. Now, what does it mean, children? When the Torah uses the expression that we are children, so number one, it tells us that God has a special love for us. But there's another reason as well. And that's page 51 now. Remember, in this year today, I'm going to read a lot. We're going to come back later. Pirush. The Torah calls us the children of God. Where does a child come from? A child comes from the brain of the father. In other words, where does semen originate from? Where does the seed come from? The brain of the father. So your godly soul that you have, because we call the children of God, and a child comes from the brain of the father, where do we come from? We come from the brain of God, whatever that means. Let's speak about God's brain for a minute. When we speak about God's wisdom and God's brain, we can't comprehend what that means. God and his wisdom are one. Us and our wisdom are not one. We need to elaborate on this. We're going to come back and explain it. God is the knowledge. He's the knowledge and the knower. By us, there are three different things. There's the knowledge, the knower, the knowing. By God, it's all one. To understand this level, to understand God's brain, we'll never be able to understand it. So it says in the Torah, if you search for God, will you find him? My thoughts are not your thoughts. God is infinitely higher, therefore we can't always understand God. Skip to page 54. We're going to leave out the grey block, and we're going to bottom of grey block. So all of a sudden, we've learned something about every single Jew. Every single Jew, from the biggest tzaddik to the biggest wicked person, all are children of God. We all come from the brain of God. And he says, bottom of page 54. And even though when you start studying the godly soul, remember we haven't even started to study the godly soul. When you start studying the godly soul, you'll see that there are different levels of souls. There are different levels of souls. You can't compare the souls of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses compared to our souls. We'll explain later, but you'll see that they're a much higher soul, a much loftier soul. It says when Moses was born, the whole house was filled with light. What does it mean the whole house was filled with light? The house, the body of the body was filled with the godly soul. So for us, the average person whose soul is not that high, we don't even feel our godly soul. For a person who's got a very lofty soul, whatever that means, he doesn't feel anything else. He just feels the godliness. He just feels. I told you a story once, I think one of the previous shurim, that they came to the Arizal, the famous Kabbalist, and they said, Arizal Mashiach is here. He was so excited. He went to the window, and he opened the window, and he said, no, Mashiach's not here. Where he was in his room, he was already in heaven. They see godliness. They live in the heavens. By us, we don't like to daven, we don't like to learn, we don't like to do mitzvahs. By a person with a very lofty soul, it's completely different. I also want to point out, by the way, that sometimes we'll see later in the chapter, that sometimes a very lofty soul can land up in a very, very difficult experience in this world. And that's why when you're looking at somebody, and he might look irreligious, and he might look wicked, and he might look ugly, he might look whatever, he might look terribly poor, you have no idea the soul that's standing in front of you. It could be the loftiest soul. There's a story in the Gemara. There was a very famous tzaddik by the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan went to swim, he went to mikveh in a river. He goes to the river, and a Jewish bandit comes and wants to kill him. He looks at his eyes, and he sees these saintly eyes. He says, you have such potential. What are you doing this for? Come, let me come back, repent, let me teach you. I see you have the most loftiest soul. Eventually, this man who's Reish Lakish marries Rabbi Yochanan's sister. And that's why when you look at an individual, you don't look at a person's activities. When you look at your kid, when you look at another individual, you never look at the external activities. What do you look at? You look at the potential within. And when somebody's standing in front of you, even the lowest godly soul is exceptionally lofty. You don't know, and sometimes a very lofty soul will land up in all sorts of issues in this world because they're searching. So you just stand with absolute respect before whoever you meet. I think I told you the story last week. Well, I might have it. I'll repeat it anyways. The fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe once decided he's going to Paris. Did I tell the story last week?
No.
Okay. The fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who died in about 1870, he decided he was going to Paris. Now, for a Rebbe to go to leave Lubavitch near Moscow and go to Paris was unusual. And he's off to Paris. He takes two followers with him, two people with him, And he gets there and he says, I want to stay in the Alexandra Hotel. The Alexandra Hotel was the Monte Casino of the day. And he gets there, and the first night he says he wants to go see the casino. He walks and he goes to the casino. Now I want you to imagine a Rebbe. He was very big apparently. He walks in with a big beard. He walks into the casino, and there was a big room. I always imagine a big carpeted room, and people were gambling, playing cards, and sipping wine, drinking non-kosher wine. Anyways, the Rebbe just stands there looking. I imagine just the appearance of such a man made everybody feel uncomfortable. Anyways, he looks around, and he focuses in on a table in the distance. And slowly but surely he walks to the table. And then he goes to the table and he focuses in on one of the people playing cards. And he bends over to the guy playing cards, drinking non-kosher wine, and he says to him in Yiddish, Junger Mann, Young man, non-kosher wine is very dangerous. I'm putting that in brackets. Non-kosher wine that you're drinking disturbs the spiritual sensitivity of the heart and the mind. Okay? That's why we're very strict with the laws of wine. Non-kosher wine that you're drinking disturbs the heart and the mind. The guy heard this, a Rebbe telling him, he went white, he put down the wine, and he just sat there. The Rebbe turned around and walked out. He follows the Rebbe out. They meet privately, and the Rebbe tells, and he follows the Rebbe back to Lubavitch, and he becomes a Balchva, he repents. The Rebbe Maharash said that the only reason why he went to Paris was to get back a very, very lofty soul. So these lofty souls can either come down as tzaddikim, or for good reason, they can land up through very wicked parents or very wicked experiences and become the most. And that's why, if you look, by the way, I'm not saying they had lofty souls, and if you look, Jews in every area, like they make their mark. They make their mark. And what's the reason for that? Whether they go to religions, where they go to whatever they go, you see, there's a certain sense of, there's a certain energy there. Now, because by the way, the numbers, 1 in 50 is a Jew. But nonetheless, if you go look at people, I've said it in Shul, who invented Zabi that the Nazis used was a Jew. Who got the Jews to first wear the yellow star was a Jew. Okay? Now these could be very lofty souls that have landed up in all sorts of issues. Anyways, so you can't compare, come back to the book, the bottom of page 50, top of page 55, you can't compare the soul of Moses and the forefathers to the souls of us. Because if you're looking at all our souls as one big body, so then you have to look at Moses and the forefathers as the head, and we like the ankle. And he says, and also in every single generation, you have the leaders of the generation. Even though, let's say we're the ankle, you're going to have the top of the ankle and the bottom of the ankle. So you have millions of levels of souls. And not just with the leaders, Moses and Aaron and to our generation, and not just the leaders of our generation, but if you compare body, just compare people. These are key words, by the way. Kikol nefesh, because every soul that you're looking at is not a pair of glasses. It's not an entity. Every soul is made up of 3 things. In other words, when you look at the body, you see green. The soul has 3 parts to it. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama. These are key words. I'd love you to underline them if you could. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama. Every soul has. So these
Rabbi,
words, nefesh.
Yeah, I'm breaking up a lot. I don't know if others are finding the same.
Anything you're saying, I was about to type it. Yeah, I can't hear anything. Can you record this, because I'm not hearing anything?
You're on mute, Rabbi. You're on mute.
Okay, no, sorry, I went on to my bad connection here. But anyways, So when you speak about the soul, there are three different levels of the soul. So I want you to imagine I want you to imagine a light show, and you have three colors mixed: a blue, red, and a yellow. The blue part of your soul, the blue color, goes into your liver and pervades the whole body. The ruach goes into your heart and pervades your whole body. And the neshama goes into your brain and pervades the whole body. Later on, we will learn much more about those three levels of the soul. Interestingly enough, there are another two parts of the soul that he doesn't mention here, called chai and yechida, that hover over the soul, that hover over the body. And that's why the Gemara says if sometimes you're walking and you get a bit nervous, what's happening? Now, you're either paranoid, or it's that part of your soul that's not enclosed in your body is seeing something that potentially could hit you, could hurt you, and getting you nervous. So what should you do? What should you do? Just say the first line of Shema or give a bit of charity. And that will push away something that could be coming your way. And that's an interesting thing. In other words, there's a whole bunch of karma around us, a whole bunch of things around us that we're not aware of on a conscious level, but are actually happening around us. And those are the two parts. So we've learned now that each and every single person, the highest to the lowest, we all have three parts: nefesh, ruach, neshama. So we learned a little bit more about the soul, and later we'll learn what the function of those are. Mikol makom. Here are the key words. Page 56 at the top. Mikol makom shorish kol nefesh, ruach, neshama. The source, the root of every nefesh, ruach, neshama. Merosh kol madregas atzoif kol dargin. From the highest Jew to the lowest Jew. Hameluvish beguf ami ha'oretz v'kal shebekalim. That soul that has come into an illiterate person and a sinful person, so to speak. Nimshach mimoich elyon shichach me'elo kaviyachol. Every single soul comes from the brain of God. Just like a child comes from the brain of God, so too every single soul comes from the brain of God. So he's going to elaborate. I just want to close the door here. It's disturbing. Okay. Now, page 57. Now remember, we compared the Jewish people to the children of God. Commercial, page 57. Haben hanimshech memoyachav. Let's take the analogy. If the Torah says that the Jewish people are the children of God, it doesn't just mean that we're the children of God, that God loves us like a parent to a child. No, we analyze every relationship between a parent and a child. Commercial. Haben hanimshech memoyachav. A child comes from the brain of the father. The seed originates from the brain. Shafilu tziparnai raglev nisava mitipazu. What comes from the brain? Every aspect. Now, therefore, I want to use the word that the seed that comes, the semen that comes from the father's brain is actually, I want to use the word, it's liquid brain. Therefore, you can understand that the child's brain comes from there, but something else comes from there as well. Every part of a person's body comes from the seed. Even the toenails, which is the lowest part of a person's body, both in stature, both in height and in stature, comes from that semen, comes from that seed. By the way, we will learn in chapter 3, just put this in brackets, I don't want to confuse you, but we will learn in chapter 3 that in fact there are 10 parts of the soul. Each, okay? How long is perfect pregnancy? Oh, I'll come back to it. Now, how does it happen? What happens to a child? The semen is put into the mother, and by being in the mother's stomach for 9 months, what happens over there? So that liquid brain goes into the mother's stomach for 9 months. And being in the mother's stomach for 9 months, it develops and it goes down from one level to another. That the seed becomes not only the brain and not only the ears and the head, but it even becomes the toenails. But nonetheless, here are the key words. But nonetheless, even the toenails, while the kid is in the mother's stomach, even the toenails are connected to the brain of the father. So the father puts a seed into the mother and it stays there for 9 months, and the entire body is created from that and stays connected to the father's brain. Now the child is born. So now you have a child. Right? Now you have a little child walking around. Where does the child's toenails get its life force from? From its own brain. And now we prove from the Gemara, it says, that That in the seed that comes from the Father, there are two colors to it, transparency and white. What comes from the white? The sinews, the bones, and the nails. So what we're proving from this, that raw seed that was liquid brain of the Father, not only becomes the brain of the child, but it becomes the entire experience of the child, even the toenails. Okay, let's leave out the bracket. We'll come back to the bracket later. Now, let's go to page 59. By the way, just interestingly enough, what he says in the bracket over here is that nail has to do with Adam and Eve's sin. Now, it's interesting because there's a lot of laws with regard to how you cut your nails. I don't know if you're aware of that. Here's an interesting thing. After the sin of Adam and Eve, they were covered in nail. God protected them with nail. Before the sin, they were without clothing. Amazing stuff. Afterwards, they were covered in nail. So there was a change in the status of nail after the sin of Adam and Eve. With this in mind, you'll understand a few laws. In Jewish law, if a person cuts their nails, what's the law? Anybody know? Hands up. Anybody know? Speak up, anybody? If you cut your nails, you're not allowed to let it fall on the floor, because Jewish law says it can cause a woman to have a miscarriage. Now, anybody who's not familiar with a bit of esoteric learning will say, well, that is pure superstition. No, it's amazing. One of the things that changed when Adam and Eve sinned, there was a change in the status of nail. That's number one. Number two, because of the sin of Adam and Eve, a woman is judged during pregnancy. Right? A woman was never supposed to suffer during pregnancy. In fact, until the flood, pregnancy was 9 hours. There was no suffering. There was no miscarriages, nothing. It also says that when a woman is pregnant, she's being judged. Therefore, what's happening? A woman's walking, and without realizing everything around us, like I want you to imagine, have you ever walked into a room and all of a sudden the alarm goes off because you've crossed a beam? Now that beam is invisible, but there are beams around. There are all beams around. You cross a beam, the alarm goes off. As a woman's walking, wherever you're walking, there's energies going on around you. Don't think there are not energies going around. The woman's walking, she hits a nail. The nail then is a reminder, it arouses of what happened with the sin of Adam and Eve. A woman is judged during pregnancy, it could cause her to have a miscarriage. So just how complex our laws can become. So when you see what you think is a superstition in Jewish law, it can be very rooted. Anybody clear? I mean, everybody clear? Okay, if I'm going too fast or I'm not being clear, please tell me. Now, page 59. So the same thing with the Jewish people, with the souls of the Jewish people. What's the same thing with the souls of the Jewish people? So let's just go through it briefly again. A child comes from the brain of the father. Father puts semen into the mother. It stays there for 9 months, and that liquid brain changes not into the brain of the child, but even the arms, the legs, and even the toenails. So too with the Jewish people above. We're exactly the same. Page 60 at the bottom. Each and every one of us come from the brain of God. We will elaborate more on what we're going to say now. Each and every one of us come from the highest level of God. That soul is going to descend. That soul, as the body's being developed in the mother's stomach, that soul is going to descend. It comes from the brain of God. The parents draw it down, and it's going to go through a world called Atzilus, another world called Bria, another world called Yetzirah, and a fourth world then gets planted into the kid's body. So all of a sudden, the soul that we have within us comes from the brain of God, but goes through 4 levels, 4 different worlds. But I will elaborate more on these 4 worlds at another time. What I want you to know for the Shia is that the soul descends through 4 worlds. The soul comes from the brain of God that transcends all understanding, but then goes through 4 different worlds until it pops into a person's body. So if my soul started at the brain of God, went through the first world, which we call Atzilus, went through the second world, we call Bria, went through the dynamics of the third world, and the fourth world, went all the way through, I'll have what we call a low soul. If the soul went all the way from the top, boom, into the person's body, he'll have a much loftier soul than me. Much more sensitive. And that's what it says, I made them all with Chokhmah. Ultimately, even the lower soul, even the toenail of the Jewish people, comes from the brain of God. Right? Nisab nefesh, ruach, neshama, Even the lowest type of Jew still comes from the brain of God. So if you meet a regular person who has a low soul, not that we experts who's a high soul or low soul, even the lowest soul comes from the brain of God. Now, how do we stay connected to God? So all of a sudden we've learned a tremendous amount of self, that we have a godly soul that comes from the brain of God. Now, but I'm walking in this world. How do I connect to God? How do I re-exercise? How do I rejuvenate? How do I re-illuminate the connection? He says, how, when I'm a regular person walking in this world, my toenails are getting its inspiration from my own brain, right? When the kid was in the mother's stomach, the toenails it was the semen that was vivifying it, so to speak. When a person is alive, what vivifies the toenails? The kid's own brain. Now, the Jewish people, what gives us our life force spiritually? What gives us our life force when we're living in this world? So he says, in each and every single generation, you have a thing called tzaddikim, godly people. And those godly people lead us. Where do we get our inspiration from? The tzaddikim. That's why you'll see in a more mystical philosophy, there's a tremendous thing to be connected to a Rebbe, to a tzaddik, because all our life force comes from the tzaddik. Page 62. There's a sentence in the Torah that says you shall connect to God. And the Gemara explains, if you want to connect to God, connect to the leaders of the generation. Because if I want to connect back to God, I have to follow the advice, I have to follow the teachings of the leaders of the generation that I'm living in. And through that, I'll be able to connect back to God, the highest levels of God. What happens if I mock the leaders of the generation? One way or the other, I'm getting my life force from the leaders of the generation, from the tzaddik of the generation. In other words, you could look at the entire Jewish people as one big body, but you can also look at each generation as one body. And the head of the body, the head of the generation will be the tzaddikim, and we all, either the legs, the arms, the heart, or whatever. I want to finish the chapter, so I'm going to keep you 5 more minutes. So what we've learned that we have a soul that comes from the breath of God, and there's nothing in between it, because if I blow, my breath will be interrupted by what's interrupting it. That's one description, which we learned last week. We learned today that we actually come from the brain of God. We're children of God, and just like a child comes from the brain of the Father, so too we come from the brain of Hashem. Now he's going to explain another thing. I'm going to keep you 7 more minutes, if I may. He's going to explain another thing. Until now, we've spoken about a lofty soul and a not so lofty soul. What is a lofty soul? It comes all the way from the brain of God into the person's body. What's a not so lofty soul? We went through the world of Atzilus, the world of Bria, the world of Yetzirah, the world of Asiyah. Went through 4 worlds, which I haven't yet explained those 4 worlds. We'll come back to it. But just understand there are 4 spiritual worlds beyond this world. The soul descends, and that'll make me have a lower soul, because it's gone through the digestive system of 4 worlds. There's another teaching in the Zohar, which, if you know Kabbalah, seems to contradict what he said now. And he's going to explain it. There's a teaching in Kabbalah that if you want to bring down a holy soul, it's important what the parents think about in the moments of intimacy. And Kabbalah says that unfortunately, sinful people don't have holy thoughts. So when 2 people, when a husband and wife are intimate, they're bringing down a soul. If they have good thoughts, that's when Jewish law, it's very strict what a woman sees in the night of conception, what they think about. So it seems to say from this piece of Kabbalah that he just mentioned now, the importance of parents having holy thoughts. That doesn't mean they can't be intimate and can't be loving, but they have to have pure thoughts. The Kabbalah says that will bring down a that will bring down a good soul, which seems to contradict what he said before. We need clarification. So he's going to say another thing. He says, Hainu, besides the godly soul, this is needs time to understand, but it's fantastic. The godly soul gets a film around it. So there's the godly soul, there's the godly soul itself, and then there's a film, a character that the godly soul gets, and that character is created by the parents' thoughts. Everything that the person interacts in this world is through this garment, so to speak. Everything that comes through this filter that the godly soul picks up. That filter, that garment, is created through the thoughts of the parents. If the parents have holy thoughts, they will create a refined garment. Here are the key words. Even if it's the loftiest soul that God's sending down, the soul of Moses, the soul of somebody like that, it's important for the parents to have holy thoughts. He says there's two things. The soul itself, God decides who's going to get a high soul and who's going to get a low soul. And for some good reason, which we'll elaborate in another share, sometimes the loftiest souls will go into the most wicked parents. As brought in two different places in the Kabbalah. In other words, it's the soul itself. All comes from the brain of God. A lofty soul comes straight from the brain of God into the person's body. The lower soul goes through all the four worlds. God decides who gets a high soul, who gets a low soul. But then there's a garment, a filter, a mechanism of communicating that the soul gets. That's created through the parents. And even if it's a high soul, it will need the sanctification of parents. Why will God sometimes put a lofty soul into very wicked parents? Because it has to have balance in this world. Because it has to have balance. There has to be a fight between good and evil in this world. So what I want you to take from from today's chapter, and excuse me moving faster, is I want you to understand that that not only do we have an animal soul, we have a godly soul. This godly soul comes from the brain of God. Even just as the toenails comes from the brain of God, just as the toenails comes from the brain of the child, brain of the father, so too the toenails of the Jewish people. The lowest type of soul comes from the brain of Hashem. So even the lowest Jews got a very lofty soul. Also, what we've learnt is that the soul, when you understand this, it's unbelievable. The soul also gets a film, a garment around it. That soul is created through the thoughts of the parents in the moments of intimacy. So now we've learned the first part of the godly soul. Next week, we're going to learn about the 10 powers of the soul. So if you remember, up until now I told you that there were 3 parts of the soul: nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Nefesh goes into the liver, ruach goes into the heart, and neshama goes into the brain. Next week we're going to look, if you come closer to this fire, you'll see that there are 10 parts of the soul. These 10 parts are connected to the 10 plagues. They're connected to the 10 utterances God created the world. They're connected to the 10 commandments. Now we're going to learn about the 10 parts of the soul, the 3 intellectual ones and the 7 emotional ones. But we will save that for next week. I want to say as follows. I want to take this opportunity to wish all of you and your families that you should be inscribed and sealed for a good, healthy year. And in merit of us learning today, we should have a healthy year. The entire world should have a healthy year. And it should just be a year of blessing. See you next Tuesday. Cheers, guys.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks very much.
No? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.